Good morning, everyone. Good Saturday, sunny morning. Please take your seats so we can get started. Welcome to our program, Media Misinformation and the Protection of Democracy. I'm Jean Morrison, the co-president of the League of Women Voters Cape Cod area, and we have organized this event for you today. The program is the second annual event sponsored by the Dr. Florence Selden Democracy is Not a Spectator Sport speaker series. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. Its mission is to empower and educate voters, encourage active participation in government, and defend our democracy. We are nonpartisan in that we do not support or oppose candidates for office, but we do take a stand on issues based on policy positions developed through study and consensus by League members, thus influencing public policy through education and advocacy. Last, we would also like those of you from the town of Barnstable to know that the Barnstable town elections are November 7th. The League of Women Voters Cape Cod area will conduct a candidate forum for Barnstable Town Council Precinct 11 race on Tuesday, October 24th at 6 p.m. in the Town Hall hearing room. The last day to register to vote for Barnstable Town election is October 27th. There is information and registration available at a table set up by our voter services in the lobby. I also want to tell people that this forum is being recorded, and we have a special guest, Elizabeth Foster Nolan, who I want to acknowledge for coming down from Boston? Weymouth. Well, it's still pretty far. She is the president of the League of Women Voters, Massachusetts. So, welcome everyone, and let me now bring Karen Mazur, chair of the Florence Selden Democracy Speaker Series Committee, who will introduce our speakers for today. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Jean. Our Speaker Series Committee selected the topic of today's program because we believe that mis and disinformation are threats to democracy in many ways. Okay. Not only do they deny people accurate information, but disinformation deliberately manipulates people by spreading anger, fear, and hatred. We have only to look at current events nationally or internationally to realize that nothing good comes from ignorance, fear, and hatred. Democracy begins with each of us, individually, taking responsibility for the news we consume and the information that we share with others. We are pleased to welcome two experts in the field of media studies and journalism. Our first speaker is Dr. Joan Donovan, Assistant Professor of Journalism and Emerging Media Studies at Boston University's College of Communication. She will help us understand the many ways that mis and disinformation are spread and what we can do to be wiser consumers of news. Our second speaker, Dan Kennedy, is Professor of Journalism at Northeastern University, and he will focus on the importance of sustaining local independent news. To save time, lengthier profiles of their recent accomplishments are listed on your program. We have allotted 1 hour for presentation time, followed by a half hour for questions from the audience. These questions you're going to be submitting on an index card, and League volunteers will collect the index cards after the first speaker and again after the second speaker. As we will spend more time on the spread of misinformation through social media, Dr. Donovan will be speaking for the greater portion of time. So, Dr. Donovan, welcome, and please begin.
More applause, please. Woo! What a good-looking group. Born and raised in Saugus. Spent a little time in Canada, living in Montreal, bopped around to California, as one does in their youth. Spent a little bit of time, forgettable time, in New York City, and now am back in Boston where I belong. So really happy to be here. And if any other folks need me for any events or whatnot, I do a lot of what I would call community outreach or, public speaking to educate people about these issues. And so feel free to reach out. Unfortunately, at 11:30, I have to get in my car and drive back to the city because I am double booked today on the Boston Book Fair. But normally I'd like to stick around and get to know people and hear what's important to you in your communities, but always just feel free to reach out to me. Even though I worked at Harvard, I'm different. And I'm very happy to be at Boston University because of its community engagement, its pledge to invest in communities, and at this point in my career, I think it's really important that the public understand what states and technology companies and celebrities and billionaires are doing with our communication networks. Some of you might be familiar with communication movements of the past, like the Yippies, and this idea that we need to get rid of long-distance calling and that communication is a human right. I believe that. I believe that communication should be free. I believe our communication should not be owned by any particular billionaire. And I think that it's important that we protect our communication networks and make them safe, secure, and private. And so today what I want to do is tell you some stories from my book, Meme Wars, which was written primarily throughout 2020, but comprises at least a decade of research between me and my fellow co-authors, Brian Friedberg and Emily Dreyfus. And yes, her dad is Richard Dreyfuss. Totally weird. I kept making jokes about Jaws the entire time we were I was like, we're gonna need a bigger boat. She was like, shut up, Joan. Right? So as we go through the presentation, there'll be time for Q&A afterwards. I'm gonna go pretty fast, but what my hope is that by the end of it, I've sewed up all the questions and that I've answered what it is that you might be lingering. And this is the same presentation that I've given to the Secretary of Defense. I've given it to military generals, people in the Air Force. I've given it to politicians, my students. And roundly, I think it's fairly easy to understand what we're going through right now because we're all living in it and we're all both excited by the possibility of the future, but also anxious about who is going to rule us, what that's going to look like, if democracy has a chance, if journalism is going to survive the internet. And these are all very, very important questions. So I think one way to frame my research is thinking about this idea of a coming storm. It's not enough to batten down the hatches when the storm has already come ashore. Platform companies must stop providing safe harbor for medical misinformation, conspiracies, and grift that over time can erode the public's capacity to assess credible risk. That is, the quality of information that we are served every day online doesn't have a truth quota. That is, if you read something in the newspaper, you know, maybe it went through fact checking, there was editorial, there was a couple of eyes on it, they tell you who their sources are. Social media is designed differently. Social media is actually designed to polarize, not just on politics, but on everything. For example, if you go on Instagram or Facebook, you're not going to post a mediocre bowl of spaghetti. You're not going to be like, I had dinner tonight, right? You're going to say, this is the best spaghetti I've ever had, or this is, I'm in Italy eating spaghetti, right? So it always drags us to the poles of excitement or fear, outrage, and hope. And so we don't tend to post the banal, the everyday, the middle. And so in our politics, what we've come to think about is this missing middle, this whole swath of people that don't really care who's president as long as they're paying less taxes. The swath of people who don't really care about what's happening internationally because it's not happening to them personally, right? And so there are lots of people that are not engaged in news, not engaged in politics, that see and read all of this very polarizing and hyperbolic rhetoric on the internet, and they think, whoa, these Republicans, they must be crazy. And they think, oh my God, these Democrats, they must be crazy. Because what we end up seeing are these very fringe ideas, these very fringe movements tend to rise to the top. Because our news media also looks for things that are novel and outrageous. That's what goes viral online. And so it's no surprise that someone like Alex Jones and InfoWars rises to the top of recommendations during the pandemic because he's got all kinds of information that no one's ever heard of. It's like you're sitting there and you're like, is this real? And you don't know. And he's saying, I got a deep source within the government named Q that's telling you, that Mueller's going to arrest Hillary Clinton and he's really on the side of Donald Trump. And you're like, how can this be real? And he capitalized on novel and outrageous content. He literally just made it up. But because he made people think they had access to some kind of forbidden knowledge, like I know what they, quote unquote, whoever the they is, don't want you to know. And so people kept going back and going back. And we see this time and time again, especially around conspiracies online, which used to be tantamount to rumors, but now people have started to take action on them. So my research is most concerned with not that people have bad opinions or people think untrue things like the earth is flat, but rather the people that take action on those untrue things, the people who move from what we call the wires to the weeds. They get an idea online and then they move into public space and do something they never would have done, like try to overthrow the government, as we saw on January 6th, or like drink bleach or eat fish food because they believed it might cure coronavirus, right? And so these are important things that we have to address about our information environments, especially at a time when we're always online. Most of us carry cell phones with us. That means we are always jacked in to the internet. It's no longer this place that you go to at the house and you sign on to AOL and your internet lives in the computer. The internet is with us at all times, and it doesn't have the same kind of mechanisms like television, like radio, like newsprint that require at least a teeny tiny bit of truth, or else they'll get sued. There are actual broadcast regulations. Whereas on the internet, it's much more free play. And that has to do with a whole set of laws that came into being in the 1990s, which you might hear about, is talked about as Section 230. And essentially what Section 230 said was, people who provide the tubes and wires online for people to send email are not culpable for what gets sent in that email, right? This is when those technologies were happening. But that law didn't anticipate that our cell phones would be able to broadcast high definition audio and video and do all kinds of other things that weren't envisioned by that law in 1996 that said basically if people are running a gambling ring on email, they're not going to hold Yahoo accountable for that. But that law has now been interpreted to mean anybody who runs any web service online is not responsible for anything that happens. And this has really disrupted all of our industries, from education to the military to housing with Airbnb to taxi industry with Uber and Lyft. It's kind of crazy to think that you would open up an app and just let a stranger drive you to the airport and know that you're going to be out of town for the next 2 weeks. But nevertheless, things have changed. It's kind of weird you'd pull up to a town and say, well, you know, I'm just going to go live in this person's house. They left a key in the mailbox for me, right? There are reasons why we have standards in health standards in things like housing, so that you don't get bed bugs and whatnot. Which is why the hotel industry exists. But nevertheless, technologists have really ran ahead of policy. And our policies now are being used to retroactively try to rein in technology. But these technologists know that they just need to change the name of what they're doing, not the actual practice of their business, like Facebook switched to Meta, and they become absolved of any of their prior issues. So I'm going to give you some definitions that hopefully will help you in navigating this world of mis and disinformation. So the idea of misinformation is information whose inaccuracy is unintentional and spread unknowingly. Disinformation is information that is deliberately false or misleading, often spread for a political gain, profit, or to discredit a target individual, group, movement, or political party. The main difference here is intent. If we can figure out who is behind a set of messages and they're saying things like, we're going to trick the public, or look at this, I made this media, I made this content, spread it far and wide, that's where it would be considered disinformation. So some people's disinformation is other people's misinformation. Because if you then go and share disinformation unknowingly, which we all have done, what ends up happening is that we are sharing misinformation because our intent isn't the same as the disinformers. But nevertheless, these definitions tend to be used interchangeably. But in research, we really think about it as intent is what really matters here. So when we study media manipulation, I like to use this image as a way to think about it. And we study ABCD, actors, behavior, content, design. So when I think about this record player scenario, what it teaches me about design is that the telephone company isn't thinking about the record playing company when they design their technologies, right? And once a human enters into the loop, it's incredibly difficult to figure out what ridiculous things humans are going to do with different components of technology. So here, you just see someone playing a song for their friends, probably just got the record, put it on the record player. Maybe the record player company thinks a little bit about the speaker company because there are standards built into that. But certainly the record player company isn't thinking about their song being played on the telephone, right? So humans take different pieces of technology and link them together. So you can imagine the record player being YouTube and a video playing on YouTube, and then the speaker is something like Twitter, where it's being promoted, and then people will take that link and then broadcast it, let's say, on the news. And so this was how Trump was very effective at leading the media in what we would call setting media agendas, because he understood all the different components online and how they plug together. So he was able to use the speaker almost like a megaphone to make the mainstream media cover whatever that day he thought was going to be important. And we have a few other influencers in our world that are capable of doing that these days, including someone like Elon Musk, who's able to direct media attention. In moments of war, for instance, we start listening to certain people more and other people less. And those influential people tend to use Facebook, Twitter, YouTube in order to broadcast and scale their narrative, let's say, good, bad, or indifferent. So if I were to say a lie right here and it's not being broadcast across the world, 60 people might leave thinking, well, that was a load of BS. But if I were to post that same lie online, 1 million people might leave with that same idea. So this is why design matters, because I will tell you what a technology company like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter does is all it does is scale information. It is primarily an advertising system. So essentially, advertisers pay for people on those platforms to see their ads. And we, as users of the platform, are allowed to use that same exact infrastructure to post things we like our family, and like the pizza we ate, and, pictures of a birthday party. But it's the exact same infrastructure that an advertiser is using, that a government is using, all within the same platform. And what's important about design then is how it scales. The decisions that are made by the platform companies, by what we might call algorithms, decide if they're going to turn up the volume on a post or turn it down. So when you hear people saying, well, this post was, it went viral, that just simply means the volume was turned up and more people were exposed to the post. If they say that the post has been shadow banned or de-indexed, it means it's been demoted and the volume has been turned down. But essentially what these technology companies do is decide how much of what bits of information are going to reach which audiences at the right time. And so you'd say to yourself, well, this is just the logics of marketing, right? It's like, and this is what we've seen in political campaigns have moved away from, your basic door knocking campaigns and have moved into marketing. And you'll see a lot of marketers now parading around as if they're, revolutionary campaign staffers because they know how to purchase a Facebook ad, for instance. So whenever we study this, we want to look at the actors, the behavior, the content, and the design, because it's not always just bad actors. Sometimes the design is what's making the problem much worse. This is why we have to hold tech companies accountable for the products that they have built. So I'm going to go through what we study when we study media manipulation, and it's a 5-point life cycle, and I'm going to go through this pretty fast, but I'll show you as we go on. So basically, when we study something like a media manipulation campaign, we're looking at its origin points in stage 1. Stage 2, we're looking at how it spreads across the web and platforms. Stage 3, we're looking at who's responding. Are the politicians, industry, celebrities, journalists? Like, how is the lie getting spread and who is responding to the lie? That's the most important part of this all. Then we're looking at mitigation. Did something happen? Did they get deplatformed? Did they lose their account? Did their link get a fact check on it? And then lastly, we look at the adjustments by the manipulators to the new information environment. And you can read about 60 case studies that we've done on mediamanipulation.org. It's all open source and free to read. So I'm going to show you the Sam Hyde case study, which essentially this guy is an internet comedian who is also a vicious racist. And he's been around for many, many years. And he's a key figure in the book Meme Wars in a few different chapters. But since 2015, he's been identified online as a shooter in San Bernardino, Kalamazoo, Hessington, Kentucky, Minneapolis, Planned Parenthood Clinic in Colorado Springs, U.S. Naval Base in San Diego, and on and on and on. And this is because he's taken pictures of himself looking like a white supremacist. He dyed his hair blonde, he's posing with machine guns, he's posing in MAGA hats, and the idea is to go viral in moments of crisis. So while the news is breaking that something horrible is happening, fans of his will post, he can't keep getting away with it, that's the meme, and images of him. And I'll give you some examples in stage 2 of how that works. I was actually on campus at UCLA that day during a shooting, and this was one of the tweets circulating. Suspect Sam Hyde was a noted white supremacist and Donald Trump supporter. People who were locked down on campus were sending this to each other, saying, look out for this guy, right? But it was well known amongst people who study this stuff that this was a lie. As well, Bill O'Reilly, breaking, one alleged shooter confirmed as white supremacist Sam Hyde. And so on and on and on, it traded up the chain to national media. And even in one case, we started to see responses by different media. And I'll show you one that was very problematic, was from CNN. And I want you to listen to this clip from CNN and note that a politician gets on the phone with CNN. This is during an attack in Texas. And the politician says to CNN, we know who the suspect is. His name is Sam Hyde. And this is because the politician was probably just handed a note from his assistant who was just on Twitter saying this is the up-to-the-date information rather than relying on boots on the ground law enforcement investigation. So we'll take a look at this clip. If it comes up. There we go.
And are you learning any more about how investigators are now piecing information together? Do you know anything about the attacker?
We don't. It was reported to me that he's actually not from this community. Apparently, his name was released as Sam Hyde. That was the name I was given. We don't know any more details. I assume probably there'll be search warrants executed probably later in the.
So for people who do this kind of trolling for fun, this is a win. This is considered a trophy to get someone at CNN to say the wrong thing. And this is, younger folks online, nihilistic. They think media is a joke. They think reporters are a joke. They think journalism is a joke. Wait, am I describing Elon Musk? No. But he's from that world. He's from those sets of younger folks that have grown up mistrusting media, mistrusting governments, and sometimes for good reason, other times because they just simply think it's funny. So how did this get mitigated? Well, basically what happened was we saw a bunch of different news organizations issue fact checks. These are clips from BuzzFeed, the New York Times, Business Insider. All have come up with different explainers on who Sam Hyde is and what the pictures are. As well, he had a TV show on Adult Swim called $1 Million Extreme, and after BuzzFeed reported on it as an alt-right TV show in 2016, it was taken away. 2018 reportedly banned from YouTube and Instagram, but he's returned, and then recently suspended from Twitter for homophobic insults about Jeff Bezos. And so he continues to keep popping back up in different ways online because it's really not possible to ban someone from social media. They can just keep signing up and trying different things. And because of the overturn in these different companies, many people don't even remember who was banned last week for whatever problem. So how did adjustments happen after all of this mitigation? Well, essentially, nothing happened. Here's a tweet, unfortunately, from Adam Kinzinger about the ghost of Kyiv. So I'm going to read this bottom tweet. So this is obviously a photoshopped picture of Sam Hyde as an ace fighter. And it says, from Raoul, Ukrainian ace fighter pilot known as the Ghost of Kyiv, real name is Samuel Hyde, a 36-year-old who was identified as the MiG-29 pilot, accredited with downing 6 Russian jets. And Kinzinger, when he was in Congress, wrote, the Ghost of Kyiv has a name, and he has absolutely owned the Russian Air Force. Godspeed and more kills, Samuel. This was a disinfo campaign inside a disinfo campaign. What they were referring to was images of what ended up being a video game simulator of a fighter jet taking down 6 other planes. And the reason why that video game simulator went viral was because people that were part of the Ukrainian diaspora outside of Ukraine were sharing it because they hoped that someone was going to send planes at that point in the war. And this was, you can see, February 25th, 2022, so right at the start of the war. And so hope is what drove that disinformation campaign into the public and gave the Ghost of Kyiv a name. And then trolls added the layer of Sam Hyde. And then, of course, we needed to have wasted journalistic resources saying, fact check, comedian Sam Hyde is not the Ghost of Kyiv. This is happening all day, every day, on every platform. We are living in, especially the last 2 weeks, a fog of information warfare. And we are all part of it, even if we like it or not, because even if you abstain totally from social media, it's influencing how the news is covered, it's influencing how journalistic resources are spent, it's influencing how politicians are spending their time and what kind of issues they're taking up. So the internet, unfortunately, and the internet culture is driving quite a bit of the division and polarization in our world. Because ultimately, you all know that you know other people who vote, and they might not be the same party as you, but they're not monsters, right? They're not awful people. They're related to us. We have disagreements. But if you go online, you would think that everyone has somehow become deeply possessed, like in The Exorcist, you know? They're just drooling pea soup. Come on, guys. It's Saturday. Lighten up. So then another time, more recently, was a fact check saying, no, Samantha Hyde is not the name of the Nashville school shooter. So again, another Photoshop of Sam Hyde looking like a female in the moment of another news crisis, and on and on and on. If you look up what's going on with the current war in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel, you will undoubtedly find Sam Hyde content on every platform. So why study this? Well, I'm going to take a little bit of a backup and just give you some idea of what memes are and what they do and why the internet is so, I don't know how to describe it, like awash in them. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the world. All I can do is picture like a big junkyard. You know, it's just filled to the brim with memes. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes? Okay, I'm gonna go rapid fire then. So basically, we've seen memes our whole lives. If you were familiar with the Uncle Sam poster, it's been redone hundreds, if not thousands of times, but you probably don't know that it didn't even originate in the United States. It's actually something that came from the London Opinion. So our most American symbol, aside from maybe the American flag, is actually British. Weird, I know. And so what is a meme war? Well, meme war is the use of slogans, images, and video on social media in a persuasive political campaign. So don't get caught up in the verbiage of everything. Just understand that meme wars are information war. And so meme wars tend to be authorless. They promote in-groups and out-groups. They tend to be sticky, and they tend to promote participation. That is, people start to remix them. So this is a picture of Pepe the Frog, which is a popular meme online, remade to look like a Trumpian version of Uncle Sam. The original Pepe is pretty interesting. I blacked out the little frog butt so that you don't have to avert your eyes. But basically, it's a comic where it's a whole comic book series. And it's about this guy named Pepe and his friends, and they're all animals. And the frog man goes in the bathroom, he drops trow, and then his friend Dog Man comes in and says, whoops. And then later that day, Dog Man says to Pepe, I heard you pull your pants all the way down to go pee. And then Pepe says, feels good, man. And why this is funny, I am a woman, so it had to be explained to me, is that when men go in the bathroom, they don't put their pants on the ground. In fact, all of our clothing are equipped with zippers, which mean nothing to women. But for men, this is so their little butt cheeks don't hang out in the wind during bathroom time. But this little piece, Feels Good Man, became this meme the world over. People were posting it. Every kid knows what this is. And then it became a symbol of the far right online. And people started redrawing Pepe's because it's a very easy character to draw. And so what ended up happening was that this moment in early 2000s, in 2011, about memes really exploded into politics in a very different way than we would have expected. So we had the We Are the 99%, the Occupy movement, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And by 2016, though, political campaigns were adopting this viral style of communication. So you had Bernie Sanders leaning into fans were making this kind of art about him. These are all punk band logos, and this appealed to the kind of Gen X millennial crowd. You also had Bernie Sanders from, this is something the campaign made. Remember when a little bird, came up on the pedestal and looked him in the eye like he was Snow White and then flew away. So the campaign was like, we need to meme this, Bernie Sanders. So they went ahead and did that. And then you had Trump, who understood memes as advertising. So 3-word statements, just like just do it or I'm loving it, build the wall, stop the steal, lock her up, jobs not mobs. And he even would repost himself as Pepe. And most people were like, why is he a green man? I don't get it. But this was to tap into that far right audience online. And he also posted this, which is very anti-Semitic. And he wouldn't admit it was anti-Semitic. He just said that's a 6-point sheriff star. But once it was traced back to a neo-Nazi site, this image was traced back to a neo-Nazi site, and there was no Fox News. The whole thing is engineered. He took it down. It's one of his only deleted tweets because it was obviously anti-Semitic. So 2016, though, you also had Hillary Rodham Clinton, right? Beautiful meme, really memorable. No, right? This is a postcard. And this is what Obama had done in 2012, as he went online basically with postcards. The hope poster of Obama that we all know and have had probably on our walls. That's the campaign that moves online but doesn't adapt to online sensibility. It doesn't adapt to advertising online. It doesn't understand the power of memes. So even I'm with her was a terrible hashtag because the use of an apostrophe meant that it would break the stream of the hashtag. And so, but I showed you this image earlier, right? How many of you saw that and thought this is disinformation? Anyone? Did you guys see it and was like, why is she showing this? Yeah, a few people. Basically, this is a picture of my friend Aaron, who is a Canadian pediatrician, and I saw this circulating on his Facebook page one day, and someone posted it and said, "Is this you, bro?" And he said, "Yeah, that's a picture from my wedding." And then someone linked to a Reddit post where they were making tons of memes that looked like they were coming from the Hillary campaign, but were in fact disinformation claiming, let's draft our daughters. So this is how innocuous and seemingly small-minded, it just seems like it's part of the ephemera online. It just seems like it's part of the mood, right? And so if you are scrolling through the hashtag I'm with her and you see draft our daughters and you see all this content, you start to wonder, well, has Hillary lost her mind? And we don't even have a draft. So this was taken up and became a firestorm online. Hillary Clinton eventually published an explainer about Pepe. All of these other Pepes kept being posted in replies. She then used the term basket of deplorables, which was then turned on her and her campaign. She also came up with the term fake news. She was the first to apply it to websites like Breitbart, and then that was also inverted against her. Okay, now I know I'm going over time, so I'm just going to get to the bottom of it, which is to say, in January 2017, we all remember the memes about Richard Spencer, who was the head of the alt-right at the time, getting punched during Inauguration Day. But what we don't notice is on his lapel is a Pepe pin. And the author, or the originator of Pepe, Matt Fury, actually killed him off in May of 2017 because he was so tired of it being used as an alt-right hate symbol. It was just a comic book, but because of the way the internet works, it became much more than that. So how do we wrap this up? Well, the Buffalo Manifesto was something that really caught my eye because I think if you study memes, you start to understand what was happening at a much deeper level online, especially with our youth. Which is to say that there was a shooting in Buffalo at a grocery store where the assailant was targeting black people. And he was doing it because he had posted this manifesto online and he wanted the violence to bring attention to his ideas. And he interviewed himself in the manifesto. He posted this image, which is a sonorod, which is a rising sun that's a well-known neo-Nazi symbol. He wrote, "What do you want?" This phrase is called the 14 words, and I'm not going to say it out loud, but it's a neo-Nazi mantra. Then he posted pictures of Sam Hyde, claiming it was pictures of himself, right? And he says, "The truth is my personal life and experiences are of no value. I'm simply a white man seeking to protect and serve my community, my people, my culture, and my race." Journalists were reposting these pictures from the manifesto saying this is what he looks like. And they were doing it because what kind of heinous person would put a joke in a murder manifesto, right? But this was because his intention was to reach beyond the media and reach the next mass shooter and show them that he was part of that underground meme culture online and that he was in on the joke. So we need to take a whole of society approach to mitigating misinformation, which includes we need to bone up our public health sector and get them to understand what's happening in public health. We need more news, more journalism that are attentive to what's happening online. We need more civil society organizations attentive to disinformation. We need government to enact policy. We need technology companies to cut the shit and start doing proper moderation. We need university research. We need advocates and activists, and we also need networked publics. That is, publics that are interested in the truth. Truth needs an advocate. Truth is a human process, and we only arrive at it through research and debate. So that's where I'm going to end. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I'll go take a seat over here. And my apologies to the local Dunkin' Donuts. I didn't get to go there, so I'm drinking the wrong kind of coffee today.
Thank you, Joan. It is definitely a very complex topic, and we're so glad that you've helped elucidate that for us. At this time, I'm going to ask the League volunteers to collect index cards. If you have any questions, we will ask you again after Dan Kennedy speaks. And while we're doing that, Dan? Please welcome Dan Kennedy. Woo!
So it's great to see this crowd this morning. Thank you all for turning out for this important talk. I think that Joan's presentation was especially important. What I'm going to be talking about is why reliable, robust local news can be an antidote to misinformation and disinformation. And what I want to take a look at is what has happened to local news. We all know that it is in trouble. And to end on a hopeful note and take a look at some possible solutions to this. So let me begin with this. This is a very well-known map put together by researchers under the direction of Penelope Abernathy, who is now at Northwestern University, tracking counties in the U.S. that literally have no local news outlet at all. And the phrase that she has popularized to describe these places is news deserts. So what happened? I think what we see is that 2,500 newspapers have disappeared since 2005, and most of those were local papers devoted to covering local news. Many more of the papers are left are what Penny Abernathy calls ghost newspapers. I call them zombie papers, where they continue to come out, but there's very little in the way of local news in them. There may be news from other parts of the owner's holdings. There may be wire news. There may be just press releases. We also saw that about 6,000 newspaper journalists just disappeared between 2018 and 2020. That is a lot of people, and that was actually just before the pandemic hit. Now, the pandemic's kind of complicated. The pandemic almost, in some ways, was good for some segments of the local news business. Of course, it wasn't good for humanity, but it sparked a real re-interest in local news. So what went wrong? Newspapers, and I refer to newspapers because they have traditionally been the vehicle for most local news coverage, but of course what we're moving into now is much more digital. Newspapers were always reliant on advertising for their revenues, and even though they charged for their product, they were almost giving it away. And so much of what they depended on were classified ads. And we all know what classified ads are. It used to be that it took 2 people to carry in the Globe from the front porch on a Sunday because there were so many classified ads in it. And those just essentially disappeared. They went to some of the early projects like Monster.com and things like that. And then eventually they almost all ended up at Craigslist, which is a mostly free service. Most of the rest of the ads, what's called the display ads, that could be everything from department stores to tattoo shops to local restaurants, those went to Facebook and Google. And because of some nifty digital manipulation that Google did, which is being challenged in court right now, the value of digital advertising dropped to almost zero, which was fine with Google because they can make it up on volume, but local newspapers can't do that. But then finally, we saw the rise of corporate chains and hedge funds buying up so many of our local newspapers. And local newspapers still have revenues, but unfortunately the chains were taking the revenues that these local newspapers were churning off, I should say a lot fewer revenues than there used to be, and using them to pay down debt and enrich their owners. Now, why does local news matter? Local news matters because surveys show that Americans are far more likely to trust local news and information than they are national media. Now, if you dig down into this a little bit, what they tend to be talking about is local TV news, which isn't quite local. It's more regional. I mean, I think we have some pretty good local TV news operations in Boston, but they're not covering the Barnstable Select Board. But nevertheless, they're certainly covering important regional news. There's what you might call a corruption tax. And this is one of my favorites because this findings show that communities that don't have a reliable source of news and information end up having to pay a higher interest rate when they go into the bond market to borrow money to build a new fire station or a new high school or something like that. And what this shows is that the people who are putting up the money for this borrowing know that there's nobody keeping track of their money. So they want a bit of a premium for the risk that they're taking on. Political participation declines. We have lower voter turnout, we have fewer people running for office, and we have more straight ticket voting. And why is straight ticket voting a symptom of a bad local news environment? Well, it's because people aren't really particularly educated about the candidates. So they say, well, if I like Democrats or I like Republicans, I'm just going to vote for all of them. Polarization hits home. Professor Jonathan Darr and his colleagues did a study where they took a look at a newspaper in Southern California that eliminated all national sources of opinion journalism for a month. And what they found was that it was measurably less polarization at the end of that month. They were able to compare it with another community, and then they did focus groups and they talked to people, and the temperature went down. Now, this paper did not eliminate all opinion content, they just eliminated national opinion content. And they were actively soliciting opinion pieces about things that were taking place locally. And that not only turned down the temperature, but arguably it left people better informed about the things that really matter. This is pink, hide your eyes, this is pink slime, finely textured ground beef. We've also seen the rise of what are called pink slime news sites. And these are essentially fake news sites that are started for political purposes, essentially, mostly on the right, a few on the left, that are taking advantage of the lack of reliable local news and information in order to look like real news sites. Now, I have to say, there have been some very good studies on this, and I think we all ought to be concerned. But when I've looked at them, I'm not very impressed. One of the pink slime news sites we have in the Boston area is the North Boston News. Any of you ever been to North Boston? No, I didn't think so. They're just kind of, at the moment, they could exist as kind of placeholders. But I think what we ought to be concerned about is that they could be weaponized at any time and populated with political content that promotes misinformation and disinformation. So the solution is, I believe, we can overcome national polarization to some extent by bringing back healthy local news. And it can be done. There are independent projects that are succeeding across the country and around here. They're free of debt, locally owned, committed to doing the traditional public service mission of local journalism. The challenge is to find ways to encourage more of them. Now, I'm going to introduce you to 4 of them. One of them is featured in the book that Ellen Clegg and I have coming out in a couple of months. The other 3 are more local, and what I've tried to do is illustrate different business models to show how they're making their money. Because without sources of revenue, there is no local journalism. So let me begin with the Provincetown Independent, which is a for-profit. It's a public benefit corporation. And what that means is that although it's a for-profit, they are bound by some special rules that allow them to take the profits and put it back into the operation rather than use the money to enrich their owners. It's kind of a term of art. It doesn't mean all that much. It's more of a statement of values than anything. Now, I should disclose I'm a member of the Board of Advisors of the Provincetown Independent. We haven't really done anything yet, but we're there in case they need us. Maybe we'll get a lunch out of it. I hope so. A few other things about the Provincetown Independent that's very interesting. First of all, they charge more for a digital subscription than they do for a Print Plus digital subscription. Why would they do that? The reason they do it is because Provincetown has a very vibrant downtown with a lot of advertising, and they really want people to see these ads. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the editor and co-founder of the Independent, Ed Miller, told me that he picked up this trick from the Enterprise papers, which cover Falmouth and Bourne. And it's a pretty interesting idea. Another thing is, by having a print edition, they can get public notices. Massachusetts has a law that requires public notices to appear in a print newspaper. It can't be digital only. Now, that law isn't working very well these days because there are so many communities that have a digital project, but they don't have a print newspaper. And I've actually been talking with a member of the legislature about how that might be reformed. If nothing else, maybe a community that doesn't have a print newspaper ought to be allowed to advertise in the local community website. So that's the Provincetown Independent, and it's a terrific paper and website, and they are finding ways to get by as a for-profit, which I think is important because so much of what we're seeing these days are nonprofits. And here's a nonprofit. The Bedford Citizen is in our book called What Works in Community News. And what really interested me about the Citizen is that it started as a volunteer project, and it's, you know, given who this crowd is, it started as a project of 3 people in the League of Women Voters. And how about that? And they were going to all these meetings and reporting back to their membership on what was taking place in the school committee, the select board, planning board, you name it. And they finally said, why don't we just write this up and make it public? And that was the origins of the Bedford Citizen about 11 years ago. Now, over time, they brought in a volunteer who was a professional fundraiser, and they've been able to build up a fairly substantial budget. So today, the Citizen has a full-time paid editor, a part-time paid reporter, and paid freelancers. So they've really begun with volunteer roots and turned themselves into a sustainable and successful news operation. Now, the other thing I thought was worth mentioning about the Citizen is that they put out something called the Bedford Guide. It's an annual magazine that they put out that accomplishes 2 things. First of all, everybody in town advertises in it. Second of all, everybody in town gets it. It's mailed for free to every household. And if you are a digital-only news organization, one of the biggest challenges you have is to get the word out that you exist. And what the Bedford Guide does is once a year, every household in Bedford gets this guide and is informed about the Bedford Citizen. Here's something local as well. The Nemasket Weekly is part of a local chain of 4 papers, and there's not that much to say about them except that they've got kind of an interesting twist on the for-profit newspaper model. They don't mail it out, they don't sell it, they distribute it to high distribution places in their communities. I grew up in Middleborough, and Gannett closed the Middleborough Gazette a few years ago. Well, now the Nemasket Weekly has come in to take their place, and they have 3 other papers as well. So free paper, distributed around the town, free website. They're making a go of it, and they're doing a pretty good job. So, can government help? This is an interesting question for those of us who have been in journalism all our lives, because we're always very skeptical of the role of government interfering in the independence of the press. By the way, I currently live in Medford, and one of our best sources of news and information is a newsletter that comes out regularly from the mayor. And it's pretty good. We don't have a local paper anymore. This is about all we get. But you know, it says a lot of nice things about the mayor. And I think she's doing a pretty good job, but you know, there's nobody holding her to scrutiny at the moment. So there are several ideas for government assistance that might not impinge too much on the independence of the press. And one of them is, this has been renamed about 5 times. It's currently the Community News and Small Business Support Act. And this would establish tax credits for news owners who hire and retain journalists, and also for local advertisers. Now, at one time, there was a tax credit considered for subscribers. That's not in there at the moment. At another time, the tax credit for publishers was included in the Build Back Better Act, but you may recall that President Manchin decided that he didn't want that in there, so that was the end of that. It seems like a pretty good bill. It wouldn't interfere with the independence of the press particularly, and in addition to that, it has a 5-year limit, so that provides 5 years of runway to come up with new business models. There's another proposal that would force Google and Facebook to negotiate with news publishers to pay for the journalism that they republish. This is somewhat more problematic. Facebook has really indicated that they don't need news, and they will walk away if anybody tries to force them to pay. Google does want it because their mission is to index everything. But Facebook doesn't care about news particularly. Google is facing a number of legal problems. I'm kind of thinking that this is an idea that has come and gone, but we'll see. In New Jersey and California, the states are providing direct public assistance to local news. New Jersey has a board that news organizations can apply to pay for specific reporting projects. In California, recent graduates of UC Berkeley are being paid to cover communities that are not well covered, especially communities of color, through a fund that the state has established. Massachusetts, we're kind of lagging. There was a state news commission that Governor Baker signed into law a couple of years ago. I had a hand in drafting that legislation. I could tell you a long story about this. I'll just tell you that 2.5 years later, nothing has happened. There is talk of tax credits for news subscribers. And as I mentioned, discussions are underway to reform the public notices law so that communities that have no print newspaper would have a better option in advertising in the local digital publication. By the way, one of the founders of the Bedford Citizen once said to me, and they're digital only, as I mentioned, she said, if I had to run off 25 copies of the Bedford Citizen on a mimeograph machine in order to get public notices, I would do it. Let me quickly wrap up with the role of philanthropy. Recently, a $500 million effort was announced to try to bolster local news over the next 5 years. There's a little bit less to it than meets the eye because some of that money had already been committed. But nevertheless, it is welcome news. Most of what we see these days are nonprofits. They try to get by on a variety of different revenue legs, voluntary memberships, large gifts, and what they call earned income, which is advertising. Nonprofits can take advertising, and events. As I said, nonprofits have really become the prevailing method for coming up with new sources of local news. We really need for-profit as well. I think we need a variety of different models. And that is it. This is the book that Ellen and I will be coming out with in January. And you can follow updates to our book, listen to our podcast, and just generally have a hell of a good time at whatworks.news. So thank you very much.
I'm going to teach the book. Yeah. I start teaching in January, so I'll put it on my syllabus.
I won't teach my own books.
Really? That's crazy. They come to learn from you. Teach what you know.
Thank you very much, Dan. That's a topic near and dear to our hearts. We enjoy the local papers that we have, but we have lost some of our local papers. So this is good information for us. Excuse me, I lost my index cards.
Look at how
there.
far apart we are. This is like COVID.
I know.
This is like Putin sitting across from Macron, 20 feet apart.
We're going to debate now.
So I have some of the questions already, and if you have other questions, please pass them in. This first question is from a Harvard College student. What can the average person do to try to prevent misinformation and disinformation?
See, it's like one of these questions like, how can individuals stop climate change, right? It's like at that level now. And the problem is that you have to get the companies on board. So get degrees, go work in these companies and change how they operate, right? That's one way of doing it. Or your friends that work at these companies, convince them to change how it operates. Unfortunately, within tech, the salaries are so high that you can really justify anything in your mind. And I will tell you that a friend of mine, let's say a friend of mine worked at Facebook in public health. And when the COVID misinformation was happening, they said, well, people are gonna figure it out. And it was like, no, science is gonna figure it out. But for right now, people being told that they can test for COVID by holding their breath and they can get rid of COVID by drinking water every 15 minutes. This is bad. Even if it doesn't hurt someone, it's bad for them to think that they can test by holding their breath, right? And so there was also the situation in Canada that happened recently where Canadian policymakers said they were going to develop this local news fund and that tech companies were going to have to pay into it. And Facebook just said, well, in that case, we won't allow any news links on Facebook. And so they just broke all the links to things like CNN and MSNBC and Fox News. And it's chaos, right? Because we go to the internet because we believe it to be a place of free and open information. But it's really not. It's not even a public square like we would have imagined it would operate. You know, a lot of people say social media is like a public square. At best, it's a McDonald's at 2 a.m., right? You go there for a purpose, and if you cause trouble, the manager's going to kick you out, right? But when it comes to everyday people, be very discerning about what you share. Take a look at it. So I have a new piece in Time this week. So if you signed up for the event, I don't think there was an RSVP, but anyway, go to Time Magazine, time.com, and look up my name. And at the end of it, I have some recommendations for everyday folks for dealing with disinfo. That is, if you're looking at something online and it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Anything that's exciting your senses and making you feel outrage or making you feel sad or making you feel like you need to share this right now, take a step back and look and see, you know, is this an ad? Sometimes it's just that simple of being like, well, this was forced into my feed. Take a look at the accounts that are sharing it and look at their avatars and see if those images are even real, if they're real people or not. Take a look at the responses to certain posts online and see if there seem to be authentic engagement or if there's a bunch of comments that are like, cool, awesome, because that's just engineered engagement to try to get something to trend or to try to get something to show up in the algorithmic feed. So there are ways of discerning what might signal that something is amiss, but unfortunately, we're in a really tough predicament right now. We have a war raging in Ukraine. There is a war going on in Gaza and Israel right now, and the images coming out are atrocious. They're horrific. And we have the situation of President Biden saying in a speech that he saw beheaded babies. I mean, this is awful. But then he got fact-checked, and it turns out he didn't see beheaded babies, thankfully, but he read news reports about them, right? And so it's very important that we understand what's out there and then also don't believe everything that we see. The other thing I didn't get into, and we could maybe do another talk at a later time about deep fakes and all of the new technology that's out there that can create images and video that look very realistic. It's almost like everybody has access to CGI type special effects these days. So we have to be really discerning, and that should turn us towards the local. It should turn us into thinking about what can I do in my local community? How can I better spend my time rather than trying to sift through all this information? Think about what do I really need to know, and what are the sources of what I need to know, and how do I get better access to those sources?
Thank you, Joan. I just want to cover as many questions as we can. Here's another question for Dan. You spoke on news deserts, primarily newspapers. What advice would you have for public access news channels to fill that gap?
I'm sorry, I don't hear well.
Okay, you spoke on news deserts, primarily newspapers. What advice would you have for public access news channels to fill that gap?
You know, one of the arguments that Ellen Clegg and I make in our book is that anything can work and anything can fail. I think that what we have primarily seen when people get together to try to fill the gap in local news in their community is that they tend to start a nonprofit, digital-only project. That seems to be the way most places go. In fact, Ellen is involved in a digital startup called Brookline.News, which is a very vibrant nonprofit. But at the same time, I was presenting some of the other alternatives to that, and I think that the model of Nemaska Week and its sister papers is very interesting. It's free print, free digital, distributed around town, get advertising, and make money as a for-profit. So we do see a variety of different things that work very well. I would also point out that he's not in our book, but we had him on our podcast. Tim Coco is the founder of a nonprofit radio station in Haverhill called WHAV. He's not the founder, he revived it. And it's a newsy radio station with a lot of news on its website. So there you go. You've got web, print, radio. As I said, anything can work. One of the other projects that we interviewed I was going to call her a young woman, but that's just because everybody's younger than I am. A woman who founded a project in Southern California called Santa Cruz Local. And it's digital only, but what's most interesting about Santa Cruz Local is that they have a bit of a minimalistic website. They save their best stuff for a podcast. And they do these deeply, deeply reported podcasts just every so often. And they've made that work for them. So I think that really people in the community have to get together and say, what are we going to do about this problem? And there are no easy solutions because there's a lot of work, but I think it can be done pretty much anywhere.
Here's a question for both of you from one of our local journalists. How can we get young people to realize that news, especially local news, matters when many see it as a joke or a meme?
I'll just say very quickly that young folks do value local information in different ways, and we've lost a lot of the ways that they would normally engage with local news. We're just talking about something like the Boston Phoenix. That was my gateway newspaper. That's how I became sort of addicted to news, was reading the music section of the Boston Phoenix and getting excited about going to concerts. I was in 6th grade, and my teacher would bring the Boston Phoenix from the city to Saugus for me, and I loved it. And I think that those kinds of newspapers can be really helpful for young folks to understand that local information is arts, is culture, is exciting. Online, they're really interested in different kinds of news sources that are non-traditional. They tend to take the form of like YouTube blogs. For instance, there's a young man that goes live every day on YouTube, Hassan Piker, that is incredibly popular with young folks. And all he does, he does a lot of commentary, but he just reads the news. Like he'll look at the New York Times website and read the headline and start reading reading the news out loud to someone. It is bizarre. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of bloggers every day that do this kind of YouTube engagement. So YouTube is almost like the AM radio of prior generations. It's like the talk radio. And so they're plugging in that way. My biggest worry is that we're losing touch with what we really need in democracies, which is timely, accurate local knowledge. Talk. We need real talk. So timely, accurate local knowledge might take the form of news, but it might take other forms as well. And it might come in other mediums like podcasts or videos or short clips or TikToks. But I think the more we can do to develop arts and culture reporting, the younger you're going to have the younger generation is going to value all of the ancillary information that comes along with engaging in that kind of reporting, or the funnies, right? Like we teach people how to read the newspaper by young folks by teaching them how to read the comics, right? And so these are important institutions that we need to keep up with. Unfortunately, the way the internet's designed is it's dismembered the paper. So no longer is there a whole paper, but it's every individual article is linked to rather than an entire corpus. And sometimes you need levity with your atrocity, right? Because that's what makes us human.
Well, of course, the old cliche is that young people don't care about local news until they buy a home, maybe have kids. Then they care about the local tax rate, they care about the schools and neighborhood development and things like that. And I do think that there's some truth to that, but I also think it's true that we have not done a very good job of reaching out to a younger audience and kind of reaching them where they are, which is what Joan was speaking to at the moment. I'll just run down a little bit about the New Haven Independent for you. I always like to joke that well, it's not a joke. I think New Haven may be the best covered medium-sized city in America, and it's really because of the New Haven Independent. It's a nonprofit, digital only. They update it throughout the day. A lot of nonprofits tend to be a little dull. Mm-hmm. The Independent is quite lively. The founder, Paul Bass, has always valued storytelling. Believe it or not, the New Haven Independent has a comment section that's very engaging. And so, people can check in on it a couple of times a day while they're at work or maybe in school and see what's new and maybe post a comment. And then finally, for the last 10 or 12 years, they have had a community radio station attached to the website. And one of the failings that the Independent had was really reaching out to communities of color. And this was a significant failing because New Haven is a minority city, as we used to call them. The Independent was always avidly read within the black community, but they didn't really have a lot of presence beyond that. The radio station has about 30 hosts, and they're all people of color, and they have really used that as a way to reach out to all different communities in New Haven. And as Joan mentioned, podcasts, pretty hard to listen to the radio station. It doesn't even reach all of New Haven. But everything is available on podcasts, and that's pretty much how people listen to it.
This is a question regarding local government.
This is going to have to be my last, unfortunately.
Okay.
I'm watching traffic stack up. 93 is going to kill me.
Are there any best practices that a municipal government can follow to deliver its own news, given the lack of local news reporting?
Best practices for what?
That a municipal government can follow to deliver its own news, given the lack of local news reporting?
I would say redundancy. What do I mean by that? Essentially, when you are a municipal government, you make decisions, you set agendas. How can you crystallize a format where it's very easy for people in the local community to share and know what's happening? So that could mean that you post community notes. Where do you put them? Well, go and look at the local Facebook pages. There's all these different Facebook pages for every city, especially in the momversation areas around, trading baby clothes and things like that. Use these networks to your advantage and post those links in places where people are from your community. It's sometimes as simple as that. Unfortunately, many of us have this model of the internet where the idea is, well, we'll post something on our webpage, and if people want to look for it, that's where they'll find it. But increasingly, information finds us. And so really good influencers know that, and they broadcast their links in so many different ways, and they have all these different techniques of leaning on other people to broadcast their links or to repost their links. So municipal governments might think about, well, what is the format in which we want people to engage with our content, or what is the format in which we want people to know what we're doing, and then where can we put that information so it finds people rather than people find it. Does that make sense? I think it's really important these days that we understand that less and less are local things going to be discovered on search. Search is not built for localization. Search is built for national or international news. My hope for AI is that it will invert search so that when you search for something online, it will give you local news before the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Wouldn't it be great to be able to search in a much more localized news environment for information? I know people in my town, in Malden, the only thing we have is the Malden Patch, and it's just a buggy website that is nearly impossible to read, but it's the only place that you can get local information about what's happening in the municipal government or in the surrounding area. And I think that that's really unfortunate, right? And so I think it's incumbent upon us to become good information sharers and to be those advocates for truth and to pitch in where we can.
I think the question touched on citizen media to some extent. You know, a lot of people put down citizen media. I don't. I think the major problem with citizen media is that it takes a lot of time to do the local reporting that people need to be informed about their communities. But if you can find somebody who has the time and is really willing to do a good and ethical job of it, they can do some terrific work. Remember, I mentioned that the Bedford Citizen was founded by 3 League of Women Voters activists. Only one of them had ever had any journalism experience at all. It was kind of learn as you go. We are looking at, we recently had on our podcast the founder of a newsletter in Burlington, Massachusetts called the Burlington Buzz. Now, she's a writer, but she had never done journalism. And she's doing a really, really good job for her community. And she actually ended up winning some sort of an award recently from Lion Publishers, which is kind of the trade group for digital local news startups. It's for local independent online news publishers. So, as I said, the biggest problem with citizen media is that people are busy. And the idea of volunteering to cover a 3-hour select board meeting every week and then write it up, that's a big ask if nobody's paying you to do it. But if there are volunteers in the community who are willing to do that, I think that can be a great way of being informed. I mentioned that we are now a news desert in Medford. There's actually a pretty good podcast that's done by a couple of local activists, volunteer. They're not journalists. They've had all of the candidates for office on, and you know, they're certainly not getting much of an airing anywhere else, and they're doing a terrific job. They
Stan.
have a nice logo for their podcast, too.
Before Joan leaves, there's an important person that I would like to introduce. This forum is sponsored by the Florence Selden Fund. And so I would like to recognize a member of Florence's family, Abby Selden. Abby reminds us that she is actually a niece of Ira and Florence Selden. And she reminds us that their Prius is still parked in the family garage with Florence's bumper sticker, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." Thank you for being here. I know you loved them. We loved them so much.
Thank you.
Let's thank our guests very much. Thank you to Joan and to Dan.
Good to see you. Great to finally
To
meet
us,
you.
as we would like to make this an annual event. Thank you all very much.
And I'll stick around for a bit.
And Dan will stick around if anybody wants to ask additional questions of him personally.